Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at Field of Glory Empires, a brand new turn-based grand strategy game set shortly after the fall of Alexander the Great's empire. Billing itself as a bit of a competitor to Imperator Rome, there are definitely some similarities. Before I dive in, I just want to mention that I did get a free key from the developers for review purposes, but as always, that does not affect my opinion in any way, a fact that will become evident further on in the review, I think. So, without any more time to waste, let's dive on in. Set during a very interesting time period with much happening across Eurasia and North Africa, Field of Glory Empires does its best to cover the most relevant regions centered around the Successor Kingdoms and Rome. There is a short scenario you can play to get familiar with the game, but the grand campaign stretches from the British Isles over to the Indus Valley and from the southern tip of the Scandinavian peninsula down to the northern parts of the Sahara Desert. 7 major factions, 21 remarkable factions, and around 47 other factions are possible options to play as and contend against, giving a fair bit of variety as far as start locations, objectives, and just overall replayability. The major and remarkable nations are nicely handled with unique modifiers and distinguishing factors across all aspects of the game, and the minor factions are plentiful, but definitely a little less looked after. That's not so much a ding against the game as it is just a clarifying statement. While the plentiful faction count still offers differences such as start positions and situations, there is a fair bit of overlapping, as can be expected at this scale for quite a few of the factions. Multiplayer is also an option, allowing you to play a turn at a time and submit, so all players don't have to be online at the same time. It's a good way to do it so that players have the choice of being online at the same time or not, and plus the whole game works on a WeGo system, which means that you get your turn input, you hit end turn, and then all of the players' turns, whether it's AI or other humans, they're all played out simultaneously, and then you see the results. Now, once in the game, it becomes immediately apparent that there is quite a bit to manage. As with all games of this nature, it can be a little intimidating at first, but once you get used to it all, it becomes second nature. Across the top are a few resources that are needed for running a nation: money, manpower, metal, and legacy. The first 3 are acquired through somewhat obvious methods: capturing territory, building the right buildings, etc. Legacy is obtained by completing objectives, and legacy points actually determine the chance of winning the game as a whole. Field of Glory Empires is about creating an empire with a legacy. Whether you paint the map your color or die trying, if you have had good governance, you were cultured, completed all your objectives, built amazing wonders and unique buildings, and made the right decisions along the way, you leave behind a legacy long after your empire has fallen. And isn't that the best a glorious empire can hope for? Not only is this an interesting representation of what really ends up mattering in the history books, I like the way it gives multiple victory conditions without directly spelling it out and spoon-feeding it to the player. It doesn't say, build 7 temples and 3, water mills. It just says, try to build some unique buildings if you want this kind of a victory, capture all your military objectives if you want a military victory, or do a little bit of everything and you can win that way as well. A very nicely laid out system, in my opinion. Now, getting to that stage, however, will require a lot of work. No matter what nation you start as, you'll have a bunch of regions at your disposal. Now, sometimes these regions get grouped into provinces, and if you end up conquering all the regions of a province, you can upgrade them to that provincial status if you'd like. Units are recruited on a regional or provincial level using varying amounts of gold, metal, and manpower, and every unit has its own stats for attacking and defending, alongside certain traits that affect how they behave on the battlefield, where they work best compared to where they shouldn't be deployed. The rate at which units are recruited is determined by your equipment stockpile, and that's something made and stored at a regional level alongside a few other resources. While some of these resources are shared at a national level, like money, manpower, and metal, others are used locally for various purposes, like food for population growth, infrastructure for construction, equipment for unit recruitment, and culture for... well, that's complicated. We'll talk about that in a bit. To obtain these resources, you'll need to manage local construction at a regional level, and you can only build one building in a region at a time. It costs infrastructure per turn to build, and your choices are actually randomized. While this randomization can be frustrating at times, like when you urgently need a specific building to take advantage of a decision or to recruit mercenaries, I do like the implication of local politicians getting involved and you having to pick from their suggestions. I do wish there was a way to override the RNG with an extra expense. That might be a nice way of doing it, because I found myself annoyed at missing options often enough for it to be, well, it definitely left a mark in my mind when I'd often find myself needing a certain building for a certain decision or to get mercenaries, and it just wouldn't pop up no matter how many times I would try to refresh the stack of cards that I was dealt. So yes, while you are able to reshuffle the suggestions, you have to spend a few turns in limbo, and even then, there's no guarantee you get what you want. There's an interesting degree of management when it comes to the building construction, thanks to a few limitations placed beyond the RNG as well. You can only have a maximum number of buildings equal to your current population. That population changes over time, of course, growing with food surplus, and the population has its own needs that need to be fulfilled by the buildings you choose to make, oftentimes running counter to what you might need at a national scale at any given time. For example, do you ensure that the people are well fed and healthy? Do you provide cultural buildings that help reduce unrest, change local ethnicity to your own, and also help you gain more legacy points? Do you focus on infrastructure so that the future constructions are faster? Do you focus on the economy through commerce and resource gathering? Or do you work towards more metal and manpower and equipment so that you can march larger armies against your enemies faster? And that's not all. Population actually has to be assigned to the various categories of buildings, so you can't just build whatever you desire and expect it to just work. You have to balance the workforce as well. Food and sanitation fall under the same category, and military and infrastructure fall under the same category as well, while wealth and culture-related structures have their own categories each. So, smaller cities will really require some specialization, but as cities get larger, you'll be able to meander between the categories a bit more comfortably. The decision-making is further compounded by the trade aspects of the game. While not entirely involved, trade does exist as a bit of a secondary factor, and its automated nature actually means you have to be a bit more cautious about what you build and chase after. As you can see, some buildings work at their best when they have access to certain special goods. Trade goods are either locally available in a region, available from an adjacent region in your empire, or imported from elsewhere. If none of these options are available, the buildings you construct will still work, but it will drain your economy by charging you thrice the trade price of the goods. I suppose that's to imply an expensive, long-distance trade deal going on? Either way, you'll want to keep an eye on the types of goods you're producing, the types you're importing, and the types you're exporting. Yes, you can make money through trade as well, of course. Your armies and navies, meanwhile, will require their own degree of decision-making. Not only will you have to pick and choose the units within the army based on traits and stats and the battlefields they're about to fight on, you'll also have to choose suitable generals and make the right call for composition, again, based on where an army is headed. Different regions have different frontline widths, and stacking 20 of your most elite melee units into one army in a frontline that's 4 units wide isn't going to do you any favors. Heavier units will require metal to recruit and maintain, while lower tier units only cost gold for the same. Yet another thing you'll have to balance. As you move from region to region, either fighting wars against other nations or fighting local independent tribes, you'll have the option of watching the battles play out, seeing all the dice rolls in action, or you can simply see the end result. If you own Field of Glory 2, you can actually fight the battle yourself, but I'll give you more details on that later. Even though the battles are automated, I found it quite satisfying when you get the army composition just right. Different regions have different frontline widths, like I was saying earlier. They also have different terrain types, and ranged units engage first, potentially applying fatigue to the enemy before falling behind the melee lines, who then proceed to engage and cause additional fatigue damage alongside hit point damage to the unit across from them. So, if you manage to match your army composition to the frontline widths and the terrain type of multiple engagements in a row before you hit end turn, you get the joy of watching the dice gods work with you rather than against you. It is a great feeling. Growing your nation through war and battle is, of course, a core part of the game. But even here, you have to be careful. Growing too quickly increases your decadence, a representation of your nation being so full of itself and its successes that it starts to burst at the seams. Picture it as resting on your laurels, basically. I think it's really interesting to see decadence modeled like this. You're forced to balance it against culture, pacing your growth and ensuring that newly conquered regions are properly pacified and kept happy, lest a civil war break out. Apart from that, the ratio between your decadence and culture levels are compared to the same ratio for all the other factions in the game. Those who have a higher ratio with more culture than decadence will prosper. Those who have a lower ratio will age, slowly crumbling away to be forgotten by history. This prospering and aging is represented through tokens that are given to nations that find themselves in the highest and lowest ranks of this list, and when enough tokens of either kind are gained, a nation will either decay or, well, prosper. What happens depends entirely on where a nation stood before attaining enough tokens. In a worst-case scenario, there might be civil war. In the best-case scenario, a new, better government type might take hold and usher in a new era, perhaps a golden age. So, warring is all well and good, and empire management seems to be quite an interesting and intricate beast too. What of diplomacy and interacting with other nations? Well, this is the part of the review where we start to talk about some of the low points of the game. Diplomacy is something I've always found intriguing. It's all about nuance, and it's often about being clever. Things that AI is perhaps not the best at, or perhaps it's just really difficult to code it well, and so many games dance around diplomacy. Most grand strategy games have diplomacy feel mediocre at best. Rarely is it any good, really. And Field of Glory Empires falls square in that exact same spot. Diplomacy feels like it was never really a core mechanic, and sure, there are a handful of options that you have when speaking with other nations, and sure, the potential outcomes are calculated based on past actions, but I mostly felt that the diplomacy was pretty plain. Nothing special, nothing to write home about, but it's there and it works. With that said, it is nice to see that the AI actually pursues diplomacy rather actively. Often, I'd get requests for cooperation or alliances that I'd never chase after myself. Unfortunately, the most common use the AI seems to have for diplomacy is to declare war. Almost every campaign I played had me flung into multiple wars more or less instantaneously, and in at least one case, I had war declared on me by a nation that had just one turn prior asked for a cooperation treaty, which was really weird. And I get it. It's a game about war, but this swiftness to war makes things feel a touch narrow. It's like the game has a little bit of tunnel vision at times. I enjoy empire building. I enjoy choosing the right structures and trying to become an economic hub or a cultural center. If you're familiar with the channel or if you're in our Discord, you'll often hear me talk about my interest in playing tall rather than wide. I always want to see choice in games, and tall versus wide, in my humble opinion, should be a core choice in any strategy game that involves empire building. Now, sure, even a tall campaign involves war, but when 3 neighboring nations declare war on you at the same time while you're playing a small city-state without the resources to recruit units, you don't really feel like you have much of a choice other than focusing on military might as soon as possible at all times. I quickly started to feel like this game is just a vessel to take you from battle to battle, which really is too bad because I enjoyed the empire building concepts that feel like they only really start to matter later in a playthrough. So maybe it's just a matter of getting through those early stages where it's war on all fronts, and then it becomes about empire management at a really large scale. The big thing though, on top of all of this, is that battles aren't even played, they're just dice rolls. And again, that's fine, or at least it would be, if it didn't have this whole weird tacked on situation where if you owned a completely different game in the franchise, you could actually play the battles. Perhaps the strangest decision here is to exclude tactical battles from the game. Now let me be clear, when I say strange, I mean bad. In order to play a tactical battle, you have to export the battle from Field of Glory Empires, open Field of Glory 2, a $30 game from 2 years ago that you might not own, play the battle, export the battle results, open Field of Glory Empires again, import the results, and continue your game. The exclusion doesn't make sense, and the pseudo-inclusion bothers me because it makes Field of Glory Empires feel like a marketing scheme for an older game. If you're literally just playing the older game when fighting, I don't see why they couldn't just lift that part of the game and attach it to the new one. That's certainly not a good option either, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely better than requiring a second purchase. It basically becomes DLC. $30 DLC, $30 day one DLC. Now, even if you already own the game, the process is cumbersome and completely breaks the flow of gameplay. And this really is too bad because Again, I enjoyed the tactical battles I played. You have to think about your maneuvers, plotting flanking opportunities, organizing units, and maintaining morale. I've been told it's very representative of the tabletop game it uses as source material. Now, unfortunately, all that goodness isn't really a part of Field of Glory Empires, so all that goodness has to be ignored for the purpose of this review, and instead, we get left with a sour taste of clever marketing in our mouths. I believe this issue is easily fixed, however, and I sincerely hope the developers do so. A quick patch to include battles into this game will instantly make it a much better purchase for those of you that care for playing those tactical battles. There are many other strange issues that crop up from time to time in the game that are more like minor bothers more than anything. Moments that break the flow of the game or seem like oversights. Every time a turn ends, for example, you're presented with a screen that shows you how the different factions have moved up or down the rankings. While it's good to know where you sit in faction rankings because of how directly it influences your faction status through the token system, I always felt like having this screen was awkward and flow-breaking. I'd much rather have the choice to review it myself whenever I wanted, rather than be forced to see it in this awkward way. It's a UX flaw, and again, UX is something I used to do for a living, so I can be hypercritical of it sometimes. I apologize, I guess. Now, that's a minor offender compared to battles that last more than one round. Yet another UX flaw. Because of how battles are auto-resolved, any battle that lasts more than one round is divided into multiple little battles. Each round has 2 to 4 phases. Ranged units fire and fall back, potentially dealing fatigue damage. Then melee units engage across from them. Then any unit able to flank gets some flanking attacks in, and then the battle either ends in a draw or the winner pursues the loser, causing some more damage. Every round is this same method, rinse and repeat. Not only does this not make sense, because why would melee units disengage to allow ranged units to fire again, but it's also very cumbersome in how it's executed, forcing you to enter the battle screen, accept the result, and enter it again and again and again. Now, of course, you are able to skip the actual visual element entirely, but it's not just about the visual elements. The game itself recalculates ranged units' effects, stacking them on top of the results of the previous rounds. Like I said earlier, it just doesn't make sense from a in-universe perspective, and it's also just a little weird, is the best way to put it, because it doesn't make any sense. And again, just like this can be a disadvantage, you can use it to your advantage as well. Once you realize how the game calculates these battles, again, in a way that doesn't make any sense, once you accept that and you start metagaming a little bit, you can use it to your advantage. I guess I'm just not comfortable with the idea of having to metagame. I much prefer role-playing, and it's unfortunate when my army compositions have to be based off of how the game works, which seems like it should be the obvious way, but when the game doesn't mimic reality, that's where it starts to bother me. Melee units wouldn't just disengage to allow skirmishers to launch javelins again. It just doesn't make sense. Now, from an audiovisual perspective, we have a bit of a mixed bag here. I think the music is spot on. It's fantastic. It fits the themes and the moods, and there's really no room for complaint here. The sound effects are mostly okay as well, although battle sounds can get a little grating. It's very repetitive, and at times, the sound effects stack to create what can only be described as a nails on chalkboard effect. From a visual perspective, the game is nothing to write home about, unfortunately. I think the UI is okay, and information is communicated clearly enough for the most part, but the actual 3D game world feels a little mediocre. Now, visuals are not the most important thing, of course, and I wouldn't call the game ugly, it just feels a little dated. I feel like there's definitely room for added flair with the battle animations, and some of the information is presented in a slightly, maybe abrasive way, I suppose. The colors don't really match nicely, the font selection really clashes. It's a little weird, it's a little mishmashy at times, and really it's kind of unfortunate more than anything else. Also, not sure what category to slot this critique under, but some of the writing really misses the mark, and when it's such a text-heavy game, where flavor comes through the writing, it can get in the way of immersion and mood building a little bit, and it was quite unfortunate. You'll do something great, or another faction will send an insult your way, and it reads rather cheesily, rather than in an epic, sort of, I'm building an empire type of way, so just a little immersion breaking. Again, it's a bit of a nitpick, but it's something that matters to me more often than not. As anybody who frequents this channel will know, I'm not the type to give numerical scores for reviews. I think they can be a little arbitrary, and they often lead to irrelevant comparisons between irrelevant games. Instead, I look back on my time with a game and judge it based on whether or not I had fun. It took me a while to get into the flow of things with Field of Glory Empires, but once I did, I really started enjoying it. Empire building is a lot of fun with lots of things to manage as your empire grows bigger and bigger, and while factors like trade and diplomacy aren't focal points, they are present enough for the type of game Field of Glory Empires is trying to be. Population management, unit recruitment, and building management are all very easy and pretty clearly communicated, most times I would say, and the costs and benefits are always outlined, and that streamlines the decision-making process a lot without making it feel dumbed down, which is a very easy rabbit hole to get into. Now, battles are the big miss here. While there's fun to be had in nailing composition to match the battlefields and whatnot, the reliance on a separate game to play the turn-based tactical battles means one thing, and one thing only, to me at least. It was a feature that was excluded. If you don't care much for fighting battles, that works out just fine, and in all honesty, I did enjoy the game just fine without the battles, but if you want the extra tactical element, you'll have to shell out an extra $30 or so for a separate game and go through an extremely cumbersome process on top of that. Neither of those things sit well with me, really kind of bothers me, and I don't understand the decision, and that's the biggest ding in my opinion. Sure, the audiovisual experience is alright at best, and the writing is a little off at times, but the interesting ideas such as legacy, culture, and decadence mixed in with interesting population, unrest, and empire management systems makes for a pretty fun game worth a handful of playthroughs, at least in my opinion. Now, it could use some significant variation between some of the lesser factions at times, but there's definitely fun to be had here. I certainly enjoyed my time with it, and I intend to play it quite a bit more, especially once I got into the flow of things and I realized, oh, this is how all the systems come together. It's really nice to see how, when all the puzzle pieces come together, it all starts to flow smoothly, it all makes sense, and you start having a lot of fun with the game. So overall, I hope you found this review of Field of Glory Empires to be helpful. Is it an Imperator Rome killer? No, I wouldn't go that far, but it is certainly a good competitor, and if nothing else, Paradox needs some competitors in the sphere where they've kind of dominated and created a bit of a monopoly, I would say. Now, there are some interesting concepts that are very well executed, a few issues here and there with just the one big problem in feature exclusion, which may be the make or break, depending on what you care for as a player. Again, if you do care for the tactical battles, this is a miss. If you don't care for the tactical battles and you want a good empire building game, this is actually a hit, and I was enjoying it quite a bit. As always, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more strategy gaming reviews, previews, let's plays, and more. And I'd like to give a big thanks to all of my patrons and channel members for supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Of course, a big thanks to all of you for watching as well, and until next time, cheers.